Cecil Charles Windsor Aldin was born in 1870 in Slough, Berkshire, some 20 miles west of London. Although Aldin's father ran a successful building company, he was also a keen amateur artist, and he encouraged his offspring's early enthusiasm for drawing. In his teens, Aldin studied at the Kensington studio of the neoclassicist artist Albert Joseph Moore, but he wasn't happy there, and within only a few weeks he left to study animal anatomy at the nearby National Art Training School. Significantly, he also attended a summer school hosted by wildlife artist William Frank Calderon at Midhurst in Sussex. Aldin began working as a freelance illustrator in 1890 when he was still only 20 years old, and within a couple of years work had become regular enough to enable him to rent a studio in Chelsea. And it was no coincidence that it was at this time that he began a long professional association with the Illustrated London News. All his magazine work was created in tonal greys and reproduced as monochromes, and covered a wide range of subjects. And although workmanlike, it revealed little of the levels of expressiveness he would later achieve. Among other commissions, in 1894 he illustrated a serialisation of Rudyard Kipling's Second Jungle Book for the Pall Mall Budget magazine, which appears to have been his earliest venture into the illustration of narrative fiction. Most of his work to date had not been particularly humorous, but this aspect began to appear more frequently, and so did his affection for and fascination with the depiction of animals, greatly assisted by his regular drawing trips to London Zoo. By the middle of the decade, he also appeared regularly as the illustrator of light comedic verse, with sequential vignettes reproduced alongside the text, most frequently in two colours. And these revealed another significant aspect of Aldin's favoured subjects: nostalgic, good-natured depictions of an England that was rapidly disappearing as the 20th century became increasingly industrialised. But animal themes persisted in books such as the pseudo-scientific Prehistoric Man and Beasts by H.N. Hutchinson, as well as more light-hearted fare for his magazine clients. And by the later 1890s, Aldin's output was dominated by depictions of the horses, riders, dogs and locations associated with fox hunting, now illegal in Britain but at the time actually considered sport and a jolly good day out for everyone except the fox. A few were sold as painted originals, but by far the majority were created by Aldin in pen and colour washes for mass reproduction as lithographic prints, making them affordable to a large proportion of the public, and they were hung in prodigious numbers on domestic walls up and down the country. Aldin never had much interest in advertising, but in 1899 he did create this now iconic and in its day hugely popular poster for Cadbury's Cocoa. It spawned a series of others, but I could only track down this single other example to show. Although the bulk of 1900's Cecil Aldin hunting diary consisted of the blank pages for the hunter to fill in the coming year's events, the relatively few actual illustrations were further evidence of his own personal preoccupation with and participation in the activity. His largely comedic but affectionate portrayals of his fellow enthusiasts continued to be bought as prints by an eager public, and it was also in 1900 that he published a hunting garland. This was a collection of far less elaborately rendered pen drawings with selective areas of generally flat watercolour washes featuring not just fox hunting but also the equally popular fishing and shooting. They constitute a fairly radical stylistic departure from his prints, in which all elements were rendered with equal attention to detail, whereas these images were far more minimal and seem to have taken their lead from Japanese woodblock prints, leaving large areas to the imagination. Only a year later, Aldin published a collection of 12 lithographic prints gathered under the title Old English Sports and Pastimes. These were close-quarter humorous character studies and were also more simply rendered than the more scenic prints he'd been making so far. But they too sold in large numbers and brought in yet more income, making him one of the most successful illustrators of the day. In 1902, Aldin had his first conspicuous success as an illustrator of dog-themed humorous fictional books. A Dog Day, written by Walter Emanuel, featured a collection of graphite and spot colour illustrations, which, despite an absence of anthropomorphic devices, effortlessly created a totally plausible and likeable miscreant animal character. And it was also in that year that he published 10 Little Puppy Dogs, which used more gestural but highly expressive brush and ink work, printed entirely in monochrome, which demonstrated similarly believable anatomy and personality. 1904's The Snob was another story written by Walter Emanuel, and given the success of their earlier collaboration, it wasn't surprising that Aldin was again called on to bring the tale to visual life. And he did this with a collection of grainy two-colour illustrations with the same technique and narrative accomplishment. His own illustrated story, the now somewhat misleadingly titled Gay Dog, was published a year later, and it successfully wove together a humorous narrative with suitably comical illustrations about a mischievous young dog and his various exploits. But Aldin didn't neglect his other themes, and in addition to the production of yet more prints about a variety of sports, he also found some success in France, another country with a similar fascination for hunting, with a series of covers for the magazine Les Sports Modernes. In 1909, The Perverse Widow by Richard Steele, written in 1709, and The Widow and Her Son by Washington Irving, a century later, were rather oddly published as one volume, and both stories, and consequently the illustrations Aldin created, were more about two-legged animals and their ways than his usual subject matter, rendered in both black and white and colour. It was also in 1909 that the Humorous book about the not very capable fictional huntsman known as Jorrocks was published, which further exploited his by now tried and tested formula of slightly foolish human beings riding or falling off horses in the pursuit of foxes. And this was another featuring both colour and monochrome illustrations to illuminate the text. Now as much of a household name as any illustrator could claim to be, Aldin was invited to illustrate a lavish 1910 edition of Charles Dickens' The Pickwick Papers. The images he created for what was already perceived as a fond and nostalgic narrative were remarkably evocative ink and watercolour wash paintings, which brought the writer's genial mid-Victorian story to very plausible and entertaining life for the reader. This was the heyday of what were known as gift books, which were intended to fetch prices higher than the working classes could afford. They were beautifully and expensively bound, and the colour reproduction was the finest that could be produced at the time. Although the great majority were aimed at the children of the wealthy, this was manifestly intended for teens and adults, and was more unusual in that regard. Of course, it was a massive success and quickly sold out to the better-heeled readers. The following year's Red Puppy book was by comparison a far cheaper excuse for more endearing canine frolics, drawn boldly with brush and ink, but always expressively, and all the illustrations were printed on cream paper stock with a single reddish-brown solid overprint. Niels Heiberg's story of a terrier and a fox, White Ear and Peter, was published in 1912. With a collection of exceptionally well-rendered, emotionally charged watercolours about this unlikely friendship, and a strong supporting cast of other species. Again, despite the obviously improbable nature of the narrative, Aldin kept his evocations of all the animals absolutely correct throughout. And although I don't know for sure, it seems likely that this would have been another book aimed at those with deeper pockets, given the obvious quality of the offset lithographic colour printing. Cecil Aldin's Happy Family was also published in 1912, and the hatched pen drawings and added limited colour washes depicted scenes of animal interactions guaranteed to appeal to children and adults alike. The text was no more than captions, and the images were undoubtedly the primary focus of the book, and they were uniformly visually eloquent. Backgrounds were merely suggested where necessary, and the generally boisterous antics and comic interplay of the various domestic animal characters was perfectly captured. The following year's equally amusing animal book was titled Cecil Aldin's Merry Party, even though the text was actually supplied by Byron May. It featured more, and in this instance more than usually anthropomorphic characters. All these images were created with a bold brush outline and flat limited colours, using a very appealing subdued palette. This was more evidence, if it was needed, that Aldin could and happily did roam freely across the widest possible range of stylistic approaches, from pure representation through to simpler humorous exaggeration with ease. And as if to prove this point, 1913 also saw the publication of My Dog, written by Maurice Maeterlinck. This book contained a collection of finely rendered pen and watercolour wash images which demonstrated absolute mastery of the two mediums, and the ability to use them in combination to create credibly three-dimensional and highly appealing results. The rascally protagonist and the other animals involved in this jolly tale were once more rendered with total anatomic accuracy and posing, and yet managed to portray personality with very little need of words. The expression "a picture is worth 1,000 words" could not be better exemplified than by Aldin's little masterpieces of endearing narrative illustration for this book. The Great War erupted across Europe a year later, but Aldin was much too old to be considered fit for combat. Nevertheless, his experience with horses had him helping to manage what were known as remount depots, which purchased and supplied them to the front lines in France and Belgium. However, his son was not so fortunate and died in battle in 1916. Naturally enough, Aldin and his wife Rita never got over the loss. It was in that year that Aldin's colour images for Anna Sewell's book Black Beauty were published, despite the strict controls placed on any publishing not connected to the war effort. These typically well-rendered and occasionally dramatic watercolours had been created before the death of his son, and it speaks volume about his reaction to his son's death that there followed a period of around 5 years in which Aldin created nothing more that I could track down. But in the early 1920s he returned to children's bookwork with The Great Adventure, another project rendered with heavy calligraphic brushline and an unusually selective colour palette. And by this point his status was such that his endearing dog images were appearing on merchandise such as this line of decorated domestic crockery. But it was more serious-minded representational work which began to occupy him more, and in the same time frame he began publishing illustrated books of various aspects of English period architecture. This was a collection of graphite and pastel drawings which recorded the bucolic England that was increasingly under threat from the inexorable spread of cities. There were 3 separate volumes in the series, and in addition to their publication in books, his highly atmospheric faithful renditions of the country inns, manor houses and cathedrals were also reproduced as nostalgic lithographs for the public to buy and hang in their homes. Aldin continued to paint and produce more hunting prints throughout the decade, and in 1928 he both wrote and illustrated The Romance of the Road, with a collection of fine gestural pen and ink spot illustrations set within the text, and the added bonus of full-colour full-page illustrations of rousing scenes of horse-drawn travel from days gone by. A year later, a collection of poems by Francis Chalmers, 49 Ladies, a somewhat misleading reference to the hounds of the hunting pack, was also published. And Aldin provided a series of 2-colour double-page images which had the text set within the overall layout. Dogs remained an abiding obsession with Aldin, and he drew many for reproduction as prints. And in 1930 he published Sleeping Partners, an amusingly inconsequential sequence of pastel drawings of his dogs, an Irish wolfhound and a bull terrier arguing over the comfiest spot on the settee. By this time Aldin's health wasn't all that good, and it was in that year that he effectively retired to live in Mallorca, where the climate would be better for him. But he continued to paint and make etchings, and in 1932 his illustrations for the Bunch book about a Sealyham Terrier of that name, written by James Douglas, were published. In 1934 Aldin published his autobiography with the bleakly amusing title Time I Was Dead, and unfortunately it proved to be prophetic, as he did indeed die a year later in 1935 at the age of 65 following a heart attack while sailing back to England from Mallorca. Cecil Aldin was a true giant of British illustration, and along with a handful of others, he was largely responsible for guiding professional illustration from the relative strictures that had prevailed in the Victorian era into a much wider tolerance of less restrained and more expressive possibilities, aided considerably by the spread of offset colour lithography. But for reasons I can't imagine, he has faded into undeserved obscurity, even in his home country, without a museum or website dedicated to his memory, an astonishing body of work. Once again, I just hope this video tribute brings him at least a few more admirers at home and abroad.